Welcome to Brain Event. We are delighted to have one of the doyens of podcasting on the show, Alix Spiegel, who is one of the greatest podcasters around. I'm sure many of you have listened to This American Life and to Invisibilia, both shows that were very influential for Jason and I. And it's really a delight to have you on the show. So, Alix, instead of asking you to start with a thought experiment, I thought I'd ask you to start with a story.
Okay, so I am going to tell you the story of a woman who had a very, very unusual power. Um, Her name was Joy. Okay, so Joy, basically, what happened with her was one day she falls in love with this man that she went to school with, went to high school with. They have this kind of beautiful relationship that ends in marriage. And they, for years and years and years, they had like really, by her own account, an incredibly beautiful relationship. There was very little conflict. He was a kind man, a generous man, a great father. Um, and one day, um, her husband came home and he smelled really odd. And, she didn't know what it was. She told him he needed to go take a shower. And he did, and it didn't help. And essentially, over the next weeks and months and years, that smell intensified, uh, and just got worse and worse and worse. And also over that period of time, the kind of personality of this man that she loved changed dramatically. So he started being very disinhibited and kind of cruel, and there was a lot of conflict. And and he was just essentially the opposite of the person that she had married. And, she would other strange things would happen, like, she would wake up and he would be choking her, and, um, he just had these very odd, odd episodes, and eventually, she made him go to a doctor, and they discovered that he had Parkinson's. Okay, so that's the beginning. And then, and for a while, they kind of go on with he has Parkinson's, and they're kind of struggling to make it work. And then finally, they decide to go to this meeting for other people who have Parkinson's, and they show up, and that smell that she initially smelled was everywhere. Everyone in that room smelled the same way. And that's when she realized that Parkinson's has a smell. And she ended up reaching out to like these people who um tried to figure out tests for diagnosis, right? And they tested her, and it turns out she could, they like one of the things that they did was they took, 10 different t-shirts, and they had people with and without Parkinson's like sleep in the t-shirts, and then they brought the t-shirts back to Joy and cut them up, and she needed to identify which which t-shirts had been worn by people with Parkinson's and which had been worn by people who hadn't, and she did that perfectly except for one case. And then later they figured out that that person, in fact, did have Parkinson's, they just hadn't been, diagnosed yet. And so essentially eventually what they do with Joy is they use her ability to smell to, uh, to kind of design tests that were able to identify Parkinson's years before it expressed itself in the same way that she had identified it, though she didn't know that she identified it, years before, like a good 14 years before it got to the point that, science was able to recognize it. And she was somebody who could just smell anything. She could smell cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. They did a whole bunch of stuff, and she just had this smell, and I was interested in going to talk to her because I was interested in talking to somebody about how they managed when they had to confront dark futures. Or when they found themselves aware of a dark future that was coming, that was not yet there, and the reason why I was interested in that question was because I had, for the very first time in my life, I did some reporting on climate change, which actually, just to tell you another teeny tiny little story, which is like the reason why I took that story on, honestly, is because I heard a rumor that This American Life and Radio Lab, which are two kind of narrative shows that are similar to, well, I started at This American Life, but they're similar to Invisibilia. Like, neither of those shows would do climate stories because they're such a problem kind of narratively to do in innovative ways, and so I was just like, "Oh, I'll be able to solve that problem, like, I can figure it out with all the stuff I know. I'm gonna solve the problem of, like how to tell a climate story in a way that feels less threatening to people than it currently does." Just because, like, death and the end of the world and all that tends to make people turn it off. Anyway, so I decided to go off and do that story, and then in the process of reporting it, I moved from, like, an intellectual understanding of the problem to an emotional understanding of the problem, and, like, after that happened, that was a really big emotional experience for, I mean, I just, like, cried for 6 months basically because I couldn't, so it's so interesting, like, I couldn't believe it. Like, I had known about climate change for, like, 30 years, but then for some reason, once I actually understood what these people were saying, I was totally shocked that, like, we had let it's I was like, I was shocked. I was just shocked by it. Such a weird experience to be shocked by something that you knew about. But anyway, so I, like, suddenly understood a dark thing that was coming, and it was really a problem for me, like, to understand how to move forward, um, in this world where I saw a dark future on the horizon, like, and inevitable, what I saw then as an inevitable dark future. And so that's why I went to go to talk to Joy, because I figured, well, you have a lot of experience with, being aware of a dark future that's coming, and what can you tell me? Now, it turned out that she didn't actually have an answer to my question, but I was able to invent the equivalent of an answer through by being tricky, which is what I do to tell stories. Is I have a whole bunch of tricks and techniques and ways of thinking about it that help me solve any problems, and or solve like, somebody once said to me that, like, every story is broken, they're just broken in different ways, which is true. And so, like, I just have a lot of different skills that I've developed over the year, and techniques and exercises and ways of thinking that I've developed over the years in order to fix however a story is broken. So that's my story.
So it's very interesting because when we invited you to come on the show, Mark said to me we should really invite Elise to talk about storytelling. But it
Hmm.
sounds almost like what you're doing is not storytelling, but story creating. So you're taking the ingredients which are out there in the world already, but putting them together in a way which isn't necessarily the way they are in the world, but does involve all the elements, but are presented in a way, a new way that makes you think about some deeper question or answer some other question.
Well, Invisibilia structured its stories that way, where, like, was narrative used to engage a broader philosophical or ethical question, or just a question about the world. Like, one of the episodes was, which is more determinative, like your personality or the social context in which you exist, right? So that was a show that I did about the myth of personality, because I feel like in America there's a lot of belief in personality as, like, producing outcomes, anyway, your original question, like, you said, you're not, like, telling a story, you're creating a story. And my answer to that is, it's both. It's like, it's It's both like you're collecting materials that allow you to document what goes on in the world, right? So you collect a whole bunch of materials, and there are a series of processes that you go through in order to collect those materials so that you're using, best practice, essentially information gathering. And then you have that story, then you have a whole bunch of material, and you kind of weed or pick or sculpt your way into a narrative that, like, it grabs people and, maintains attention and organically raises, like, the ethical or philosophical question that you're trying to answer. But, not all, like, This American Life does not use narrative in order to engage broader questions. This American Life really does primarily documentary work, and, they build to what is called a point of change. Like, do you guys know about the underlying story shape? What it says is at the bottom is exposition, the beginning, there's conflict, rising action, climax, and then falling action and resolution. That's one way of looking at it. Okay, but here's another way of looking at it. Here's another way of looking at the underlying story shape. Now this is more similar to the way that This American Life organizes its underlying narrative shape. It's a character or a setting, an inciting incident, struggle, conflicts, problems, risks, dangers, crisis. So the crisis here, it's called crisis in this one, and so, like, there you have the point of climax at This American Life is called the point of change, but you can label it in different ways. So in that one, it's labeled as a crisis. In the first one I showed you, it was labeled as a climax. When at Invisibilia, I label the highest point a synthesis, because essentially I use the narrative and then switch to the idea, and introducing the idea um create the sensation of kind of like sensation of kind of coming together, or like clarity that happens if you like the same kind of thing if whether if you're titling it a crisis or a climax. Like, there are different ways of conceptualizing what that point is depending on what it is that you're trying to build.
I did a little bit of script writing, and so story structure, plays a big role in how people conceive of scripts. Um, and it does seem there's an interesting philosophical question here, right? Which is that one can devise a structure to tell a story, and that structure might be a useful aid in getting a certain kind of reaction from an audience. So having a lead protagonist who everybody cheers for, who starts off reluctant to go on a hero's journey, who has to fight some foes, who has some setbacks, but is ultimately triumphant, that's going to sell a lot of Marvel movies and make a lot of money. An avant-garde film, where you've got something like Richard Linklater's Slacker, for example, you change character perspectives every 5 minutes in the movie. It's a completely unusual structure, but it's the kind of film that inspired all these other indie filmmakers to go, if that counts as a movie, I can make a movie, right? And it's birthed a whole bunch of new story structures. And what I wonder about on the structure front is, are these things better and worse? Are they useful for a certain end, which is that if I want to take my audience on a journey where they're going to look at the world through the eyes of my lead protagonist, and they're going to go on this emotional journey, and they're going to feel some sense of relief or resolution, or they've learned something because I've taken something theoretical and I've woven it in with, something personal. You can achieve different aims. And so I wonder about whether there are better and worse aims that you can have, that there are better and worse structures that you can have for storytelling. If I think about the structure that we have on the show, it's, we start every single episode with a thought experiment because we think narrative is important. We think that it captures the mind, that someone can sort of lock onto a story. And then from there, the story is supposed to make you feel a bit uncomfortable on our show. So we push people into a dark place immediately. We want you to feel, I don't know how I feel about that. There's a dilemma here. There's a tension. And then the idea is to try and pull at the strands with the philosophical theory, where we sort of think about, what's a good way of explaining this discomfort? And then you kind of, along the way, have learned a whole bunch of philosophy without necessarily being fed it up front.
Yes.
And, Invisibilia is a show where you're giving people a lot of science, and then they've got the dessert of, personal narrative.
Right. We're using the same strategy, which is essentially stories are, it's just easy for people to track stories in a way that it's hard for them to track kind of more abstraction. And yeah, we're using the exact same, we're trying to accomplish the same thing, you guys, and me. In terms of, are some structures better? I actually have like, I have a lot to say about this. Well, it depends, I mean, like, look, I'm one of these people who, I think there are a million different ways to tell a story, right? And I tend to be non-ideological. There's a lot of ideology when it comes to, like, telling stories. Different people have different approaches and beliefs about the right way to do it, right way to get tape, right way to do interviews, like right way to structure, right way to that it's like and you were describing those kinds of choices earlier as aesthetic choices, but they're also political choices in a kind of interesting way, I think. Because like the simple example of, like, if you look at the choices made by a reporter at National Public Radio, which I was, and which I was at a certain point, versus the choices that you make at This American Life. So the choices, let's just look at how are you orienting the reporter relative to the material. At NPR, you're taught that you need to be kind of arm's length emotionally, and you're not drawing on your subjective experience, or bringing your fear or feelings or humor or any of that into the process, because the kind of pose that you're taking is of a authoritative neutral pose, which you know carries with it a certain kind of, like, you could claim more political power with that kind of pose than you would for, like, with if you're doing a story. Now, when you all of those choices are totally different at This American Life, right? Like, that you write in a kind of personal, informal way. In the tape, you're supposed to be as human as possible. You bring in your jokes, your observations, and kind of you're supposed to weave all of that in, and use that as the stuff of the story rather than the thing that you subtract from the story, right? And those, in certain ways, you could think of those as aesthetic decisions, and they are, but they're also, in certain ways, political. Like, it's about, like, how like, is this an authoritative account, or is this a kind of more personal and therefore less authoritative account? Do you see what I'm saying? So aesthetic choices are also, some in certain ways, political choices. Um, and in terms of your original question, in terms of, like, structure, there again, like, the way that you create and the structure of an NPR story is wildly different than the structure uh, of This American Life story. You're not using the underlying story shape in the context of a news story. You're using a different kind of shape.
I think what's very interesting is when a listener connects with a story, they would probably be quite put off by the notion that you made choices. Because when they connect with a story, there's a kind of magic that happens. So they feel like this is a magical story. They might weep as a result of hearing the story. But if they heard that the story could have been told a dozen different ways, that might detract from the magic of it, or shouldn't it? I remember years ago when I was studying English literature, I read that Charles Dickens, with some of his stories, released two endings. And um, the ending I read, I at the time thought was the only ending, and then was told, no, there's another ending where something else happens. It's not abridged or unabridged. It's a different ending. It's a different outcome. And I said, no, 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 I don't want to read that ending. I like this one. This is the one that I want to think happened. It's almost like once a story is written, it's like a life. Once a choice is made in life, it can't be unchosen. All that can happen is you could renegotiate future choices or regret that choice, but that choice is made. Is a story like that? Is a story, once it's made, it couldn't have been told any other way.
I mean, yes. I mean, I think people experience it that way, but that is not, in fact, truth. There are a million ways to tell a story and different ways of telling the story. Again, like it is political. There are different ways of telling the story, and they have political overtones. So, yeah, I mean, like if you look at it from and that's one thing that as a journalist you become so, I don't want to say painfully aware of, but maybe it's painfully aware of, is like, you just, every time you sit down to tell a story that there's so much information and if you pluck if you pluck idea 1, 3, and 7, you'll tell one story, but if you pluck 2, 5, and 9, it'll have a completely different kind of cast and shade, and you are very it's the same thing like taking what Nan Golden, I think that's her name, said about taking a picture. It's like, is the picture descriptive or are you kind of composing the picture, right? And the same kind of thing, you compose a photograph. You decide what to include and what to exclude. And that's the same thing with storytelling. You have a range of options and you're choosing what to include and what to emphasize and how to frame it exactly. And people shouldn't think of stories as perfect kind of presentations of the truth ever. I mean, there are always choices, and those choices always reflect the hopes, dreams, and interests of the storyteller.
So I like this idea that it's good to have a variety of ways of seeing the world and that cross training is going to be useful. So I'm so glad that you brought up Nan Golden. I started my kind of creative journey in photography, and
Oh, right.
you're doing something as a photographer where you're shooting a scene either with a model who you can direct, so you have some control over it. And I also used to shoot a lot of musicians, so there I have no control over them, but my control comes in the edit. So I'd look at all the photos that I shot over the evening, and then I would try and pick out the best version of them. And then you cut into it, when you're editing it. Um, and we'd spent an hour with Jad from Radiolab, and he started life as a musician. And he had this very interesting technique for thinking about storytelling, which was to sit and listen to the hours of tape. And whenever his skin would sort of tingle or his the hairs on the back of his neck would prickle, he'd say, "That's interesting. That's a moment I care about." So he would highlight those bits of the tape and then only use those, so that what you have are these emotional peaks.
Totally, that's what we learned how to do from Ira. So that's one of the, if you like a while ago, you asked me like, how do you know what's interesting and what's not interesting? And the like what I was taught from Ira my very first years at the show was essentially put the tape on, and when you lean forward, it's good, and you notice that you're paying attention, that means it's good tape. And when your mind wanders and you start thinking about something else, that means it's bad tape. And then you pull all of like the best, the tape that you can't pull yourself away from. This is what I did with you, Jason, right? So we had a very long conversation, and then I went through and I listened, and every time I noticed that I was really kind of like leaning in and tracking the words that you were saying really carefully, I literally pulled that piece of tape down from the first track to the second track, and then I do exactly what Jad does, which is you build with those, you write all the parts that are not that tape and build that way. And it is a process of kind of weeding, you know?
I found it a fascinating process, partly because I had no idea that it was the way it was. I've listened to This American Life for decades,
Mhm.
and the stories are 20 minutes at most. And I thought that people were interviewed for maybe half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, maybe there's a little bit of an edit, but you interviewed me for 6 hours. And I had no idea that there was that amount of that that big block of marble, which then you could carve away at. I had no idea there was so much material.
And yours is light. 6 hours is nothing.
Wow.
For a story, that was in fact, your like, 6 hours like, in fact, it is literally the definition, This American Life, of a light story. You were I part of the reason that I pitched you was because you are a one interview story. So that means all I have to do is talk to you for 6 hours. That's a much easier thing to do than what I often have to do as a reporter, which is, like, really talk to a lot of people and go through a lot of material before I can, A, understand. The first problem is understanding. That's that, like, to get to a point of understanding, I think, requires a lot of discussion and reading and material, and then, so, yeah, you're like, that was 6 hours, but 6 hours is on the light side for what they're
That's
doing. I mean,
that's gobsmacking. I mean, it is. It's incredible to hear. We interview for an hour and a half and cut down to an hour to give you an idea of our process.
yeah. No, I mean, yeah, the kill rate, and the kill rates at This American Life are just insane. There was almost no kill rate at Invisibilia, but at This American Life, they kill more than, like, 50% of the stories that they try. So you're not just you're, like you're, like, amassing a massive amount of material, which you weed and you kill, like, 90% of it, right? Like, I get this, and I get this amount of material, and I use this amount of material, typically.
How long did the Super Smeller episode take to
That one actually didn't take that long. It took, like, 2 to 3 months, which is because and that would be typical for whether it's This American Life, or sometimes it's much longer. But, yeah, so I spent 2 days with her, and then I also had 3 other people that I interviewed, so that was not a one interview story, although it's closer to a one interview story than, like, some of the things that I've done, which really involve, like, anything about climate change just is ridiculous in terms of what you have to master in order to say, like, even a teeny tiny little bit. But, anyway, so yeah, so I got probably, like, 26 hours maybe from her, and then I brought it back, and you have to cut through all those hours. Um, that means you have to listen to them just exactly in the way that I was just saying, so you have to listen to 26 hours of tape, and then you get your first selects, and then you lead down to your second selects. Those are, like, the little clips that I just told you about. Then you lead down to your third select, then you organize them, write the entire piece, and then it goes through an intensive editing and fact checking process, right? So, um, and this is true at both Invisibilia and at This American Life. There's both, it's group edits. So you're getting a lot of different opinions at the same time. Um, and there's a huge fact checking process, which, that changes a ton of things. So, yeah, it's a really intensive process to make one of those stories, whether it's at Radiolab, Invisibilia, This American Life. They're incredibly high touch, resource intensive things to produce. And there's a lot that is left out. It's mostly, sculpting.
So one of the things that Jad said to us was that it's very hard to ever replicate that model because he'd started 25 years ago. It was the only game in town. Radio shows were used to this idea of having an enormous amount of people that can work on something. And so you can sculpt this product over 3 months. And what's interesting is that, you've got this explosion of podcasts. which aren't able to do that. So they do something different. They do something maybe more in line with what we do, which is, one guest who you speak to, you do a light edit, and you kind of get out maybe a narrative, but maybe more of a kind of ideas driven conversation. But it's such a beautiful art form what you're able to do. This idea of narrative nonfiction was a novel idea and has been so influential. Um, one of the shows I worked on before is called Constitutional Landmarks, and it's about the early cases of the Constitutional Court in South Africa. And you know, I got a chance to go and speak to the judges and the lawyers who argued these cases on the death penalty and gay marriage. And the idea there was to have these different voices and then try and tell a story about this pivotal moment in South Africa. And so, Jad Show More Perfect was a big influence for something like that. Um, Thinking about the cross training notion, what were the other kinds of influences that you had when you thought about story? Are you watching a lot of theater? Are you looking at graphic novels? Are you thinking in different ways? I mean, we've used the sculpting metaphor. It's kind of like how you chisel out something that you want. Photographers are doing this. Shoot 1,000 pictures and pick out 7, or 1. So that sculpting is so important. Jason's a sci-fi writer, and so there, what you're trying to do is build something off of a completely blank canvas. Um, and that feels important as well. If you're generating the idea for a story, that generation in the beginning must be off of a blank canvas. Uh, so you've got to rely on all these different skills, all these different kinds of medium. And then also you're dealing with, largely an oral story. And a lot of people are not sensitive to that. I'm sure you've met many people in your life who say, I would never listen to a podcast. I'll read a book, I'll watch a movie, but I can't bear the idea of having to be spoken at or listen to it. Whereas, our parents' generation grew up with, radio plays. And for them, that theater of the mind was really important. So what are the different kinds of mediums that you used as influence?
I believe in stealing from every single solitary medium. Or you can call it stealing, you can call it importing. In fact, like if you think about the techniques that Ira used to with This American Life, essentially, when we started in 1995, essentially what he was doing was he was importing some of the new techniques that had been pioneered in print journalism, like the narrative nonfiction of Joan Didion and, Wolf and all those people, right? So he stole from them to reinvent this medium, which was audio. And I really, I look at everything for for techniques or approaches that I could steal and integrate into my storytelling. For example, you talked about Slack, like I think you were talking about Slacker. Did you talk about Slacker where you're moving from every so my version of that is Station 11. So my new thing that I want to do in the narrative space, because I feel like it has not yet been done in the narrative space, like in the narrative audio space, is to construct a narrative story where, well, first of all, it's like a whole series of stories, and then at the end, it's revealed how they are connected. That was the thing that happened with Stations 11. But and that shifting that you were describing, it's like from this person's perspective, from that person's perspective, from this with Slacker. Like I'm very interested in asking the question, how many different perspectives that can you include in a single narrative without losing the thread? Like, how complicated can you make? How many narrative lines can you follow, essentially? And is there some way to construct the narrative lines so that the relationship between the two people isn't, um, or the people in the story isn't revealed until the very end? Those are two things that I have not necessarily seen or heard done in my specific audio space that I inhabit, but that I saw at Station 11 and, like every year, This American Life we have a staff retreat. And like one year I was like, I want to make and part of the thing that we do is discuss, like what are things that we can steal or what have you come across that you would like to experiment with. And for me, that the answer to like one of the things that I want to experiment with is I want to try to see if I can't do more of the like flipping perspectives and creating a structure where relationships are revealed in the end. One day somebody's going to sit down and they're going to figure out how to construct a narrative that allows you to do that, but it just hasn't been done yet. But like it'll happen eventually, I bet.
So there's quite a famous Belgian film called Man Bites Dog. So it came out in about 1992, black and white film called Man Bites Dog. And it very prescient. The idea is a film crew decides to make a documentary about a serial killer. And they start off following him around. He goes to this old woman's house. He breaks down the door. He hits her on the head with a candelabra. He kills her. He takes all of her stuff. And the crew sort of say, look, we're not here to do anything but document what you're doing. We think it's important for people to be able to see what you're doing. And so the film sort of has this mockumentary structure. And then slowly, the serial killer kind of manages to lure them in little ways of being complicit. So, he just says, just do me a favor, like if you could just keep the door open while I'm moving the body, and eventually the reporters stop reporting and they become, complicit in the story. And there's a sense in which I imagine if you're spending time with documentary subjects that you can't help but be involved in the story. You're not just, a fly on the wall, you're an active participant. And so you're shaping the narrative in a way. And so I wonder about, there might be these different values that you're trying to adjudicate. So on the one hand, there's a sense of, the authenticity in the story. And there's two kinds of authenticity. There's the authenticity for the narrative piece that's ultimately published and you want it to be coherent. And then there's the what's happening in the external world stuff. You think if I wasn't here, this person wouldn't have gone on this particular journey because I asked them questions. They imagine, the person you're talking to who can smell death really starts to contemplate this idea of, you're right, I am like seeing into an apocalyptic future and I'm incredibly uncomfortable with this idea and I hadn't thought about it that way.